CEO David Matthews had spent years building his company from the ground up. As a leader, he had always prided himself on making decisions based on facts, figures, and the company's best interests. Yet, despite his success, something gnawed at him. He was beginning to wonder if he truly understood the company's inner workings. Was he out of touch with his employees? Had his position shielded him from the real challenges they faced every day? David had heard rumors from a few trusted staff members about the manager in charge of the janitorial department. It seemed there were complaints circulating about his sexist attitude and his treatment of the cleaning staff, particularly the women. But, being the CEO, David had never directly witnessed it. The manager always seemed to put on a facade in meetings, charming, professional, but something felt off. The complaints were troubling, but they never quite reached David's ears with enough weight to confront the man. That was until one day, a decision was made that would change everything. One evening, David sat at his desk, reviewing reports when a thought struck him. What if he could truly understand the daily struggles of his employees? What if he could experience the company from their perspective, without the usual walls of status and authority? That's when the plan formed in his mind: go undercover. Disguise himself as a janitor, immerse himself in the day-to-day reality of the employees, and see firsthand what was really happening in the company. His heart raced with both excitement and apprehension as he made the decision. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He'd have to give up his usual privileges, his office, his private parking spot, the respect that came with his title. But he also knew it was the only way to get the unfiltered truth. The next morning, David arrived at work in an unassuming janitor's uniform, complete with a name tag that read John. He donned a baseball cap to obscure his identity, but underneath the facade, his heart beat wildly. It felt like a surreal dream. The thought of doing something so unorthodox and humbling sent chills down his spine. As he walked through the halls, he tried to blend in, sweeping floors and mopping the halls, taking in every interaction, every conversation. The weight of his decision was starting to settle in, but his focus never wavered. He was determined to understand the pulse of his company. Little did he know that in the coming days, he would uncover more than just a manager's arrogance. He would discover a deeply entrenched problem, one that would not only shake his faith in his company but change his perspective on leadership forever. As he scrubbed the floors, his mind kept returning to the manager. What kind of man was he really? Was the rumor about his sexist behavior true? David needed to know the truth, and he would stop at nothing to find it. The office workers glanced at him but quickly returned to their tasks. It seemed like they had grown used to the janitors, not really thinking twice about the men and women who cleaned the building. David, now John, noticed the subtle ways his presence was dismissed, a stark contrast to how he was usually treated as the CEO. It was a humbling feeling, but also a crucial one. He was getting a first-hand look at how the employees in the lower ranks were often invisible to those in power. But it wasn't long before David would witness something that shook him to his core. He had just finished cleaning one of the larger offices when he overheard a conversation between the manager and a female janitor. The manager's words were casual, but the condescension in his tone was unmistakable. "You're not exactly cut out for this job, are you?" the manager said, chuckling. "I mean, cleaning bathrooms isn't really a woman's job, don't you think?" David froze in place, his heart pounding in his chest. He had heard enough. His suspicions about the manager's behavior were confirmed in that moment, and the injustice of it all ignited a fire inside him. The man was more than just rude, he was actively undermining the very people who made the company run smoothly. How could someone with such a position of power behave this way? David's hand tightened around the mop handle as he considered his next move. It was no longer just about gathering information. It was about confronting the reality of what was happening right under his nose. He wasn't sure how he would address it yet, but one thing was clear: this manager's behavior could not go unchallenged. David had to find a way to expose it. The decision to go undercover had just become much more personal, the days following David's first encounter with the manager were tense, yet enlightening. As John, the janitor, he continued his undercover mission, quietly observing and absorbing the culture of the company from the ground up. What he had initially expected to be a simple exploration of his company's daily operations quickly turned into a deeper, more troubling investigation. The manager's behavior wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. Every day, David observed the manager's dismissive and often belittling attitude toward the janitorial staff. Whether it was the way he spoke to the women, or how he treated the men with barely concealed disdain, it became clear that the manager's approach to leadership was anything but professional. One afternoon, while cleaning the break room, David overheard another conversation, this one between the manager and a new employee who had just joined the janitorial team. The employee, a young woman named Sarah, seemed eager to prove herself, but the manager's words quickly shut her down. "You'll never get promoted here," he told her casually, as he leaned against the counter. "This job isn't for someone like you. You're better off sticking to cleaning the floors." David's chest tightened. It wasn't just rude, it was discriminatory. He'd been hoping that the manager's behavior was an outlier, but now he saw it for what it truly was. The manager was actively undermining the people he managed, sowing doubt in their abilities, and reinforcing harmful stereotypes. It wasn't just an issue of leadership, it was an issue of respect, or rather, the lack of it. As the days passed, David witnessed more of the same. The manager would make offhand comments about the women in the office, reducing their roles to nothing more than their physical appearances. He made sarcastic jokes about the janitorial staff's work ethic, often suggesting they were lucky to have jobs at all. David had seen enough to know that this behavior couldn't go on any longer. But what could he do? As the CEO, he had the power to address the situation, but as John, the janitor, he was just another employee, invisible to the manager. The conflict was eating at him. If he revealed his identity too soon, it could undermine everything he had been trying to accomplish with this undercover mission. But if he did nothing, he would be complicit in allowing the manager to continue his toxic behavior. One evening, after the office had emptied, David took a moment to sit in the janitor's closet, staring at the mop in his hands. He had always prided himself on his leadership, on being the kind of CEO who listened and understood his employees. But now, he realized how far removed he had been. He had been so caught up in the higher-level decisions, the strategy, the profits, that he had overlooked the very real issues facing the people who worked for him every day. David's thoughts were interrupted when the manager, who had just finished his shift, passed by the closet. He glanced in and saw John sitting there, deep in thought. A sly grin appeared on the manager's face. "You know, you really should stop sitting around and get back to work," he said with a chuckle, as though he were doing David a favor. "That mop's not going to push itself." David's heart raced. It was as if the manager saw him as nothing more than an object, someone beneath him. The insult stung, but it also gave David the final push he needed. The manager wasn't just a bad leader, he was a bully, a sexist, and someone who had no place in this company. The next day, David made a decision. It was time to confront the manager, but not in the way he had originally planned. He knew that exposing him for his actions would require more than just a stern talking to. It would require proof, evidence of the manager's actions. If he was going to make a real change in the company, he needed to act decisively. But how? The manager was clever, manipulative. He knew how to hide his true colors behind a veil of charm. David needed to be strategic, he couldn't just confront the manager without a solid plan. David spent the next few days documenting everything he had witnessed, the comments, the inappropriate behavior, and the way the manager treated the staff. Each time the manager's words cut into someone's dignity, David noted it down. It was becoming clear that this was no accident. The manager's behavior was a pattern, one that couldn't be ignored. But even as David prepared his evidence, he knew there was more at stake than just confronting the manager. The company had a culture of silence, where employees didn't feel safe speaking up. This manager was just one example of a deeper issue. The very fabric of the company needed to change. And David knew that if he was going to make a real impact, he would have to tackle this problem head-on, without hesitation. Over the next few days, David, still undercover as John, the janitor, continued to observe the dynamics in his company. The more he saw, the more disturbed he became. The manager, Tom Harris, was not only rude and dismissive of the janitorial staff, but he also exhibited an alarming level of arrogance and superiority toward the lower-level employees. As David mopped floors and cleaned bathrooms, he overheard Tom making sarcastic remarks and belittling employees who were simply trying to do their jobs. One afternoon, while David was cleaning the break room, he overheard a conversation between Tom and one of the female employees, Lisa, who worked in the kitchen. David had seen Tom's treatment of Lisa before, but hearing it directly, it made his stomach churn. "You really think you're cut out to run this kitchen?" Tom sneered. "I mean, it's not exactly rocket science, but it's probably too much for someone like you." His voice dripped with condescension. Lisa, clearly uncomfortable, tried to smile politely, but it was evident she was trying to deflect the comment. I'm doing my best, Tom," she stammered, avoiding eye contact. "Well, I hope your best is good enough," Tom replied, his tone cold. "Maybe you'd be better suited for a different role. Who knows, maybe one of the other departments could use someone like you." David stood behind the cleaning cart, heart pounding. He had seen enough. The way Tom spoke to his employees was nothing short of demeaning, and he could feel the anger rising within him. These weren't just innocent mistakes or misunderstandings, this was a pattern, a systemic problem that had likely been ignored for far too long. And Tom wasn't just disrespecting the staff, he was perpetuating a toxic culture that stifled the very people who made the company run. David couldn't stand by any longer. He knew he had to act. But what could he do? He had to keep his cover intact to gather more evidence. He couldn't confront Tom as CEO, not yet. But he knew that what was happening in that break room, and across the company, wasn't just about a manager's bad attitude, it was about something deeper. There were people, real people, being treated unfairly, and it was up to him to change it. The next few days were a blur. David spent his time sweeping and scrubbing, but his focus was always on Tom. He made sure to pay close attention to how Tom interacted with the other employees, especially the women. He noticed how Tom never once praised the work of the janitorial staff, how he'd walk past them without so much as a nod, but would always have something sarcastic to say. David also saw the fear in the employees' eyes whenever Tom was around. They'd quickly straighten up when he entered the room, almost as if they were anticipating the next snide remark or degrading comment. The worst part was that no one ever stood up to him, not out of cowardice, but out of a deep-rooted sense of hopelessness. They had no power. They had no voice. And David knew that if he didn't do something, this toxic cycle would continue. One evening, as he was finishing up his shift, David decided to stay late and clean the offices. It was a quiet time, with few people around, which meant it was the perfect opportunity to witness Tom in a less public setting. As he pushed his cart down the hallway, David saw Tom in his office, speaking loudly on the phone. David hesitated but then decided to listen in, hoping to gather more information. "I don't care if she's been working here for years," Tom's voice was sharp, filled with frustration. "She's just not cutting it. Maybe it's time we make some changes, if you know what I mean. We can't afford to let anyone drag us down, especially not someone like her." David's heart sank as he recognized the voice on the other end of the phone. It was one of the senior executives, someone who should have known better than to tolerate this kind of behavior. David had suspected that Tom was more than just a bad manager, he was a symptom of a bigger issue within the company's leadership. But now he had confirmation. The conversation continued, with Tom discussing how he would handle employees who weren't performing up to his standards, even if it meant pushing them out of the company. There was no mention of offering support or constructive feedback, just a cold, calculating plan to get rid of people who didn't fit his vision. David's anger boiled over. This wasn't just about Tom's treatment of individuals, it was about a larger problem within the company's culture. This was a toxic environment where people were afraid to speak up, where respect and fairness were second to profit. And it had been allowed to continue unchecked for far too long. He could no longer keep his disguise. He had to take action, not just for Lisa, not just for the janitorial staff, but for everyone who had been silenced by people like Tom. David knew he couldn't wait any longer. As he finished cleaning the office that night, David made a decision. The next day, he would reveal his true identity to Tom and confront him about his behavior. But it wouldn't stop there. He was going to take this problem to the very top of the company and force a change, one that would make this a place of respect, fairness, and opportunity for everyone, no matter their role. The battle was just beginning. The next morning, David entered the office with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that today would change everything. It was time to stop hiding behind the janitor's uniform. He had witnessed enough to know that Tom's behavior was not only unacceptable but was part of a larger issue that needed to be addressed immediately. David had seen enough in his time undercover to confirm that Tom's actions were just the tip of the iceberg. David stood outside Tom's office for a moment, steeling himself. He could feel the tension in his chest. Today, he would not just confront the manager, he would expose a deeper issue within the company that he could no longer ignore. He had witnessed firsthand the culture of disrespect, and he was about to hold Tom accountable for it. David opened the door to Tom's office without knocking, something he would never have dared to do as the CEO, but now, in his role as John the janitor, it felt different. Tom was sitting behind his desk, talking on the phone with someone. When he saw David enter, he raised an eyebrow, confused. "What are you doing here, John? This is a private office." David stood firm, his hands clasped behind his back. "I think it's time we had a conversation, Tom. One without any distractions." Tom's eyes narrowed. "What's going on, John? You've been acting strange lately. Is something wrong with the floors or the bathrooms?" David didn't waste time with pleasantries. He had heard enough from Tom, and now it was time to speak up. "You know exactly what's wrong, Tom. I've been watching you for weeks, and I've seen how you treat your employees. The way you speak to them, belittle them, and dismiss them as though they are beneath you. That's not leadership. That's bullying." Tom's face turned red with frustration, clearly taken aback. "What are you talking about? I'm just doing my job. If people don't like it, they can leave. Simple as that." David took a deep breath, trying to maintain his calm, even as his anger simmered just beneath the surface. "No, Tom. It's not that simple. You've created a toxic environment, one where people are afraid to speak up. Where employees are treated as disposable. I've heard your conversations with the staff. I've seen the way you dismiss their concerns, degrade their efforts, and undermine them at every turn." Tom's eyes widened in disbelief. "I don't know what you think you're implying here, John, but I'm the one in charge. If people aren't meeting expectations, it's my job to make sure they do. You've got it all wrong." David stepped forward, his voice steady but full of conviction. "You're not just in charge of productivity, Tom. You're supposed to lead by example, to support and guide your employees, not break them down. You've been using your position to make people feel small, and that needs to change. It ends today." Tom stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "Who the hell do you think you are, John? I don't need to take this from you, some janitor who doesn't know how things work around here." David didn't flinch. "No, Tom. I'm not just a janitor. I'm your CEO. And I've been watching you closely. You've been taking advantage of your position, and now you'll have to face the consequences." Tom's eyes went wide with shock, his mouth opening and closing in disbelief. You're the CEO?" "That's right," David replied, his voice resolute. "And this conversation isn't just about you and me. This is about the company and its future. You've hurt too many people, and I won't stand by and let it continue." The manager's expression shifted from disbelief to anger, then to fear. He had no words. How could he? The man he had been belittling for weeks was the very person who controlled his fate. David crossed his arms. "I've already spoken to HR. We'll be conducting a thorough investigation into your conduct, and you'll be placed on probation while we determine the next steps. Rest assured, this will not go unnoticed." Tom stood frozen, unable to respond. He had always assumed he was untouchable, that his position was secure, and his behavior would go unchecked. But now, facing David, his CEO, the very person he had undermined and mocked, he realized the magnitude of his mistake. David took a deep breath and walked to the door. "Consider this your wake-up call, Tom. Things are changing around here. You can either adjust your behavior, or you can find another place to work. But I won't tolerate any more of this." As David closed the door behind him, he felt a sense of relief. He had done it, he had taken the first step toward cleaning up the toxic culture that had taken root in his company. But his work wasn't done. He had exposed Tom, but the real challenge lay ahead, transforming the culture of the company and ensuring that no one else would have to suffer under the weight of toxic leadership. David didn't know how the company would respond to the changes he was about to implement, but he was prepared to do whatever it took. The first step was making the company a place where respect, dignity, and fairness would be the foundation, no exceptions. As he walked down the hallway, David couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about status. It was about doing what was right. And for the first time in a long time, he knew he was making the right decision. David Matthews had expected resistance, but he hadn't anticipated the fallout to be so swift and intense. Word spread quickly throughout the company about Tom's exposure, and the shockwaves reverberated beyond just the janitorial staff. As soon as David's decision became known, employees began approaching HR, sharing their own experiences of mistreatment, bullying, and neglect by Tom and, to some extent, others in leadership. It was clear that the toxic culture wasn't just confined to one manager, it was a system that had allowed it to thrive, unchecked and unchallenged. David was deeply unsettled. He had thought that confronting Tom directly would solve the problem, but he was only now realizing how much deeper the issue ran. He had uncovered more than a single bad manager, he had opened a door to a larger systemic issue. The ripple effect of his decision to confront Tom was profound. The employees, especially those in the lower ranks, were feeling empowered. They were no longer afraid to speak up, to share their experiences, and to demand the respect they deserved. Many had worked in silence for years, enduring the toxic work environment because they believed they had no other choice. Now, however, they saw David not as a distant CEO, but as someone who genuinely cared about their well-being. His actions, while bold, were giving them hope that things could change. However, change didn't come without its challenges. The senior management team, who had either turned a blind eye to Tom's behavior or, worse, had enabled it, were now scrambling to regain control. The power dynamics within the company had shifted. There were whispers in the hallways, quiet meetings behind closed doors, and uncomfortable confrontations between the leaders who were now questioning their place in this new reality. David had spent hours meeting with HR, reviewing employee reports, and speaking with key members of his leadership team. As the CEO, he was ultimately responsible for the culture of the company, and he was beginning to see how much work lay ahead. The problem wasn't just Tom's behavior, it was the underlying attitudes that had allowed it to continue. There was a pervasive sense of entitlement among certain members of the leadership team, an unspoken belief that they were above reproach, that their positions of power gave them license to act with impunity. David knew that he had to take action, not just against Tom, but against the system that had allowed people like him to rise unchecked. But the deeper David dug, the more uncomfortable truths emerged. It became evident that Tom's attitude was shared by others in leadership positions, and David had to make some tough decisions about who would remain and who would be held accountable for fostering the toxic culture. One morning, as David sat in his office, reviewing the final reports on the ongoing investigation, he received a call from a senior manager, Lisa, who had been with the company for over 20 years. She had been one of the people who had approached HR following the confrontation with Tom. "David," Lisa began, her voice steady but emotional, "I've been with this company for a long time, and I've seen things that I never should have had to. I want you to know that what you did with Tom, confronting him and holding him accountable, it's the first time I've ever seen anyone in leadership stand up for what's right." David felt a lump form in his throat as Lisa continued. "But David, this isn't just about Tom. We need a complete cultural overhaul here. There are people in leadership who have been allowed to treat us this way for too long. Tom wasn't an isolated case. His behavior was tolerated, even rewarded, by others. If you're serious about changing this company, you need to be prepared to make even tougher decisions." The weight of Lisa's words hung in the air. David knew she was right. The time for half measures had passed. He had to act decisively, not just against Tom, but against the ingrained practices and attitudes that had allowed the toxic environment to persist. This wasn't just about firing a single manager, it was about creating a new culture, one that put respect, fairness, and integrity at the forefront. David made a decision. He called an emergency meeting with the board and senior leadership. He was about to make the most difficult announcement of his career. When the room filled with the key members of the leadership team, David stood before them, calm but resolute. The room was silent, the tension thick as everyone awaited his words. "We've reached a turning point," David began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "This company is built on the hard work of every employee, from the janitorial staff to the executive team. We all play a part in our success, and no one is exempt from the responsibility to create an environment where respect and fairness are at the core of everything we do." He paused, looking around the room at the people who had once been his peers, some of whom seemed uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was heading. "Tom Harris is no longer with this company. And that's just the beginning. We are going to conduct a full review of our leadership practices, and anyone found to have contributed to or condoned the toxic culture we've seen will be held accountable. This is not just about fixing a few bad apples. This is about fundamentally changing the way we do business. Our people deserve better, and it's time we gave them that." There was a moment of stunned silence before a few murmurs rippled through the room. David could see the unease in the faces of some senior leaders, but he wasn't backing down. His decision had been made. The following days were filled with difficult conversations, difficult decisions, and difficult goodbyes. Several senior managers were let go. Others were reassigned to different roles, their power and influence diminished. The company was undergoing a transformation, one that would take time, but David was committed to seeing it through. It wasn't easy. Some employees were skeptical that real change could happen. Others were excited by the prospect of a new beginning. But David knew this was just the first step in a long journey. The work was only beginning. And while he had faced resistance, the support from his employees, the people who truly mattered, reinforced his conviction that the right choice had been made. The consequences of his actions had rippled throughout the company, and while not everyone was happy with the changes, David had no doubt that this was the only way forward. Weeks passed, and the company began its slow but steady transformation. David Matthews had seen the power of one decision, the decision to expose the truth, completely reshape the culture of his business. But the process wasn't without its challenges. Change was never easy, and the road ahead was filled with obstacles. Yet, through it all, David felt more certain than ever that this was the right path, one that aligned with his values and his vision for the company. As he walked through the office halls, now filled with a buzz of optimism that hadn't been there before, David could see the difference in the atmosphere. Employees were no longer afraid to speak up. They were actively engaging with each other, offering ideas and suggestions without fear of ridicule or retribution. The toxic environment that had once overshadowed their every move was beginning to dissipate, replaced by something far more positive. David spent countless hours meeting with employees, listening to their concerns, and working with HR to implement new policies that would prevent further mistreatment and discrimination. The changes weren't just about firing managers or reassigning roles, it was about creating a company-wide commitment to mutual respect, fairness, and support for everyone, regardless of their position or background. Despite the progress, not everyone was on board with the changes. Some of the senior managers who had remained were vocal in their criticism of the new direction. They didn't understand why David had taken such drastic steps, why he had chosen to sacrifice old methods that had worked for years in favor of this idealistic vision of fairness. They argued that the company was at risk of losing its edge, of becoming too soft to compete in the marketplace. David didn't back down. He knew that the success of the company was not just measured by profit margins and growth. It was also measured by the well-being of the people who worked there. He had learned that leadership wasn't just about making tough calls from a distance, it was about leading with empathy, understanding, and a deep respect for the people you were responsible for. The turning point came one afternoon when Lisa, the kitchen manager who had been one of the first to approach HR, came to David's office. She had been with the company for 23 years and had seen it all: bad leadership, toxic behavior, and the toll it had taken on the employees. She knocked on his door and entered, holding a folder of feedback and reports from employees who had directly benefited from the changes. "David," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for doing what you did, for standing up for all of us. I've seen so many of the younger staff members come forward now, sharing ideas, contributing in ways they never did before. There's a sense of trust in the air now. We all feel like we belong. Like we matter." David's heart swelled with pride. This was the moment he had been working for, the moment he could see the tangible impact of his decisions. He had no regrets, even though the journey had been difficult. It had been worth it to hear Lisa's words, to see the change taking root in the people who had once felt invisible. But David also knew that the work wasn't over. Change wasn't something that could happen overnight, it was a constant, ongoing process. It required vigilance, empathy, and a willingness to continuously learn from mistakes. As a leader, he would have to remain open to feedback, to criticism, and to making adjustments when necessary. But most of all, he had learned that leadership was not about wielding power, it was about empowering others to rise and succeed. One morning, a few months later, David stood before a company-wide meeting to address the progress they had made and to share his vision for the future. The room was filled with employees from all levels: janitors, cooks, administrative staff, and senior managers, all sitting together in a new spirit of camaraderie and collaboration. David felt a profound sense of gratitude. He was finally part of something that felt bigger than himself. "Today marks not just a milestone for this company," David began, his voice filled with passion, "but a new beginning. We've learned that no one is too small to make a difference. Every role here matters. From the people who clean our offices to the people who run our departments, we are all part of this journey. And together, we will create an environment where respect is our foundation." David paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. Leadership doesn't mean ruling from the top, it means listening, learning, and leading by example. I may be the CEO, but the real leaders in this company are all of you. You've taught me the true meaning of leadership, and I will never take that for granted again. The applause that followed was thunderous, filled with sincerity. It was clear that the employees felt heard, valued, and, most importantly, respected. The transformation had not only changed the company, it had changed the people who worked there, giving them the tools to build a future together. As David walked off the stage, he took a moment to reflect. This journey had been difficult, but it had also been the most rewarding of his career. He had learned that true leadership didn't just mean making decisions for others, it meant empowering them to make decisions for themselves. It was about creating a culture where everyone felt like they had a stake in the company's success. And as he looked out over the room, David knew that the best was yet to come. The company had finally become a place where every employee had a voice, and he would spend the rest of his career making sure that voice was never silenced again.